When you think of ancient Greece, you probably imagine strong Spartans and incredible temples. But what about hygiene? Well, let's just say the Greeks had some creative methods to keep themselves clean. Forget soap and deodorant. Here, it was all about olive oil, sand, and a whole lot of nerve. The good news is ancient Greeks were actually quite concerned with cleanliness and had sophisticated bathing rituals that would make your modern shower routine look basic. The bad news is that their definition of clean involves scraping their skin with curved metal tools. Their soap was made from olive oil mixed with ash, and their communal toilets had no privacy whatsoever. So before you romanticize the glory of ancient Athens, let's take a deep dive into the grimy reality of staying fresh in the birthplace of democracy. Imagine waking up in your modest Greek home around 500 BCE. There's no running water, no flush toilets, and definitely no Bath and Body Works. Your morning breath is absolutely catastrophic because toothpaste hasn't been invented yet. Instead, you reach for a frayed twig that you'll chew on until it forms bristle-like ends. The world's most disappointing toothbrush. Some wealthy Greeks might have a fancy powder made of crushed bones and oyster shells to scrub their teeth. But most folks are just going to town on that twig and hoping for the best. Halitosis was probably so common that nobody even noticed it anymore. Personal hygiene was actually considered quite important in ancient Greece, particularly for men who spent hours at the gymnasium. And by gymnasium, I don't mean a Planet Fitness with elliptical machines and smoothie bars. The word gymnasium literally means place of nakedness, because Greek men exercised in the nude. Nothing says, I'm comfortable with my body, quite like wrestling another oiled-up dude while an audience critiques your technique. Women, on the other hand, were generally expected to bathe at home, because heaven forbid a lady be seen enjoying a public soak. The double standards started early, folks. The Greeks believed strongly in the connection between cleanliness and health, a revolutionary concept that somehow got lost during the Middle Ages when Europeans decided that bathing was dangerous and possibly caused the plague. Spoiler alert, it didn't. In fact, the father of medicine himself, Hippocrates, recommended regular bathing as part of a healthy lifestyle. He was also big on balancing the humors, which involved bloodletting and induced vomiting, so maybe take his medical advice with a grain of Aegean sea salt. Still, the Greeks were ahead of their time in understanding that filth and disease went hand in unwashed hand. Public baths were a central part of Greek hygiene culture, but don't picture the elaborate Roman bath complexes that would come later. Greek bathing facilities were relatively simple affairs, often attached to gymnasiums where men would clean up after exercise. The typical routine involved sitting on a bench and having slaves pour water over you from jugs. If you were fancy, you might have access to a hip bath, essentially a glorified bucket you'd awkwardly squat in. Nothing says advanced civilization like crouching in a metal tub while trying not to splash water all over your earthen floor. And yet, somehow this was the height of sophistication. What about soap, you ask? Well, the Greeks didn't have bars of Irish Spring, but they did have something called strigil in oil. This delightful process involved slathering your entire body with olive oil, letting the oil collect all the dirt and sweat, and then scraping it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. Picture cleaning yourself with a windshield wiper, and you've got the basic idea. The scraping was often done by a slave who had the unenviable job of removing someone else's oily body grime. Next time you complain about your job, remember that professional body scraper was once a legitimate career path. Perfume played a major role in Greek hygiene, and not just because it smelled nice. The Greeks believed different scents had medicinal properties. Wealthy citizens might own elaborate perfume bottles called araballoi, filled with fragrances made from flowers, herbs, and spices. Less affluent Greeks had to settle for rubbing themselves with aromatic plants. Either way, perfume was less about smelling pleasant and more about masking the inevitable odors that came with limited bathing technology. It's worth noting that these perfumes weren't the subtle, delicate scents we're used to today. They were intense, overwhelming concoctions that announced your presence several streets away. Dental hygiene was, to put it mildly, a nightmare. Without proper toothbrushes or fluoride toothpaste, dental problems were rampant. The wealthy might use toothpicks made of metal or wood, while others would rinse with wine or chew anise seeds to freshen their breath. Some Greeks used a powder made of charcoal and ground ox hooves to clean their teeth, which sounds about as pleasant as it was effective. By the time the average Greek hit 40, their dental situation was dire. Archaeological evidence shows severe wear, decay, and tooth loss was common. Nothing says classical beauty quite like a smile full of blackened stumps. Public toilets in ancient Greece were essentially long benches with holes cut into them, positioned over a channel of running water or a pit. These facilities were completely open, no stalls, no doors, just you and your fellow citizens, answering nature's call side by side like it's the most normal thing in the world. Greeks would use small stones or ceramic pieces for wiping, or sometimes a sponge on a stick that was shared by everyone. Yes, you read that correctly. A shared sponge on a stick. Suddenly those gas station bathrooms with no paper towels don't seem so bad, do they? For women, menstruation presented its own hygiene challenges. Greek women used wool or linen rags as absorbent pads, which they would wash and reuse. Some evidence suggests they may have also used sea sponges, a surprisingly effective natural tampon. Of course, there were plenty of bizarre beliefs surrounding menstruation too. Some Greeks thought menstruating women could kill crops by walking through fields or turn wine sour just by looking at it. Because obviously, the most logical explanation for spoiled food was a woman on her period glanced at it. Not, we have no refrigeration and limited understanding of bacteria. Children's hygiene was surprisingly well considered. Greek babies were regularly bathed and massaged with olive oil, which helped keep their skin clean and moisturized. This was one of the few hygiene practices that actually made good sense. However, diapering was done with swaddling clothes that were changed infrequently, leading to persistent diaper rash and skin problems. Potty training happened early out of necessity, usually by age 2, with little clay pots serving as chamber pots. Imagine potty training a toddler without modern plumbing, disposable diapers, or even running water. Parents of ancient Greece, I salute your perseverance. Washing hands before eating was a common practice in ancient Greece, showing they understood something about preventing disease transmission even if they didn't know about germs specifically. They typically used a bowl of water, called a chernops, at the beginning of meals, especially before religious feasts. This wasn't just for cleanliness, but had religious significance too. The Greeks believed dirty hands could offend the gods. Nothing motivates good hygiene quite like the fear of divine retribution. Wash your hands, or Zeus will smite you, was basically the ancient Greek equivalent of those employees must wash hands signs in modern restaurant bathrooms. Let's talk about hair care, which was a whole production in ancient Greece. Without shampoo, Greeks cleaned their hair with water and sometimes mixed in substances like alkali or ash for extra cleansing power. Men typically wore their hair short, while women grew it long and styled it elaborately for special occasions. Both sexes battled lice and other parasites, which were simply an accepted part of life. The wealthy might use combs made of ivory or bone to remove lice eggs, while the less fortunate used wooden combs that were passed down through generations. Nothing says family heirloom quite like great-grandpa's lice comb. Hair removal was all the rage, particularly for women and athletes. The ideal Greek body was smooth and hairless, which meant painful plucking, singeing, or using depilatory creams made from caustic substances like arsenic or quicklime. Yes, people were literally burning their body hair off with what amounted to toxic waste. Men typically embraced their body hair unless they were athletes, in which case they'd remove it all for competitions. The Greeks believed excessive body hair was barbaric and uncivilized, a view they were happy to share with their hairier neighbors to the north. Sorry, can't hear you over the sound of how sophisticated and hairless we are, was essentially ancient Greece's foreign policy. Beards, however, were a different story. For much of ancient Greek history, a full beard was considered the mark of a distinguished man. Philosophers in particular rocked impressive facial hair. Just look at any bust of Socrates or Aristotle. Beard grooming was serious business, with men using oils to condition their facial hair and special scissors for trimming. The style and length of one's beard could indicate philosophical allegiances or social status. Young men would dedicate their first beard shavings to the gods as an offering, marking their transition to adulthood. Imagine if modern teens had to ceremonially present their patchy first attempts at facial hair to a deity. Actually, given how those first beards usually look, maybe keeping them far away from divine eyes is for the best. Nail care existed in a rudimentary form, with the wealthy using metal tools to clean under and trim their nails. Long nails were generally considered uncivilized, so keeping them short was the norm. There was no such thing as nail polish, though some evidence suggests that henna might have been used to color nails in certain regions. The concept of the manicure was still millennia away, so those Instagram-worthy gel extensions would have blown ancient Greek minds. You purposely make your nails longer and paint them bright colors? What kind of barbarian are you? I can hear Aristotle asking incredulously while stroking his well-groomed beard. When it came to keeping clothes clean, the Greeks had a system that was labor-intensive but surprisingly effective. Washing was typically done in rivers or large basins, using a combination of water, wood ash, and sometimes urine as detergent. Yes, you read that correctly, urine. The ammonia in urine is actually quite good at breaking down grease and grime. Clothes would be soaked, scrubbed, rinsed, and then laid out in the sun to dry and bleach. This was women's work, or in wealthy households, the job of slaves. The next time you complain about doing laundry, remember that at least you're not collecting the family's PTUs as tied. The Greeks wore clothing made primarily of wool and linen, which had different cleaning requirements. Wool was rarely fully washed because it would shrink and felt when wet. Instead, it was aired out, beaten to remove dust, and spot cleaned. Linen could be washed more thoroughly, but required extensive ironing with special metal tools to smooth out wrinkles. Without elastic, zippers, or even buttons, Greek clothing was essentially elaborate fabric rectangles held together with pins and belts. This simple design made cleaning easier, but required constant readjustment throughout the day. The phrase wardrobe malfunction would have been redundant. It was just called wearing clothes. The sewer systems in ancient Greek cities would make modern civil engineers weep. In Athens, there was a rudimentary network of drainage channels that ran along side streets, carrying waste and rainwater. These open sewers meant that walking through the city after a rain was like navigating a toxic obstacle course. Some wealthier homes had drainage systems connected to these channels, but most people simply tossed waste into the street or used chamber pots that were emptied into designated areas. The concept of watch out below originated for very good reasons. In some cities, there were laws against emptying your chamber pot on someone walking below your window. The fact that this needed to be legislated tells you everything you need to know. Public health was a surprisingly advanced concept in ancient Greece. Some cities had officials responsible for street cleaning and waste removal, recognizing that filth contributed to disease. Epidaurus, famous for its healing sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius, had advanced water management systems and was kept meticulously clean. The Greeks understood that clean water was essential for health, building aqueducts and cisterns to supply their cities. However, theory and practice didn't always align. Even Athens, the pinnacle of Greek civilization, would have smelled absolutely horrific by modern standards, with animal waste, food garbage, and human excrement creating a pungent urban bouquet. Personal grooming went beyond the basics of cleanliness to encompass cosmetics and beauty treatments that would make a modern influencer's skincare routine look minimalist. Wealthy Greek women would apply white lead to their faces to achieve that coveted, "I've never seen the sun" complexion, which was both a status symbol and slowly poisoning them. Rouge for the cheeks came from red ochre or mulberry juice, while kohl, a paste made from ground antimony, burnt almonds, or copper, defined the eyes. Men weren't exempt from vanity either, often using oils and waxes to style their hair and beards. All this primping and preening took place using polished metal mirrors that gave, at best, a blurry approximation of one's appearance. Speaking of skin treatments, the Greeks had some creative approaches to dealing with acne, wrinkles, and other complexion issues. One popular face mask involved mixing bean meal with honey, egg whites, and narcissus bulbs, a concoction that probably smelled divine but did little for actual skin problems. For particularly stubborn pimples, a mixture of sulfur and resin might be applied, which would at least explain why you were single more effectively than blaming it on your acne. Anti-aging remedies included crocodile dung facials, imported from Egypt for the truly desperate housewives of Athens, and various herbal poultices. The irony is that with their Mediterranean diet rich in olive oil and fresh vegetables, the average Greek probably had better skin than most of us modern folks, despite their questionable skincare regimens. Foot care was particularly important in a society where walking was the primary mode of transportation and sandals were the footwear of choice. Calluses and cracked heels were managed with pumice stones and olive oil treatments. Public bathhouses sometimes offered foot cleaning services, where attendants would scrub away the accumulated grime of Athens' dusty streets. The wealthy might have slaves dedicated solely to foot care. Imagine having toenail trimmer to Pericles on your ancient resume. Walking barefoot was common indoors and in some sacred spaces, which meant that foot hygiene wasn't just about comfort, but also about not tracking half the agora into the Temple of Athena. The connection between sweat and body odor was well understood, even if the science behind it wasn't. Greeks associated excessive sweating with poor health or character flaws, believing that your body's emissions revealed something about your inner nature. Athletes were an exception, as their sweat was considered honorable, earned through exertion rather than nervousness or gluttony. Some physicians even tasted patients' sweat as part of diagnosis, which definitely wouldn't fly with modern medical licensing boards. I'm sorry, sir, but your perspiration indicates that you've been eating too many figs and not enough barley. Also, you need a mint like yesterday. Ear cleaning was a regular part of hygiene routines, with special spoon-like tools designed specifically for scooping out wax. These ear picks were often made of precious metals for the wealthy and more humble materials for everyone else. Some Greeks believed that earwax had medicinal properties and collected it for use in healing salves, which might be the least appealing recycling program in history. Excessive earwax was sometimes treated by pouring warm oil into the ear canal to soften the buildup before removal, a practice that actually makes some medical sense, unlike many of their other health interventions. The gymnasium wasn't just for exercise, but served as a crucial space for male grooming and socialization. After working out in the nude, because clothes were apparently optional in ancient Greece, men would have oil applied to their bodies, then scrape it off with strigils, removing dirt, sweat, and dead skin in the process. This oil scraping routine was followed by a cold water bath or shower, believed to invigorate the body and close the pores. The collected oil-dirt mixture, called gloios, was sometimes collected and sold for its supposed medicinal properties. Yes, people were buying bottles of sweaty man grease and applying it to their ailments. Next time someone tries to sell you essential oils, just be grateful they're not trying to sell you essential gymnasium scrapings. Body odor standards were wildly different from our own. While cleanliness was valued, the smell of honest sweat wasn't considered offensive in the way it is today. In fact, certain male-dominated spaces like the gymnasium probably reeked by modern standards. Some historical accounts suggest that women found the natural scent of athletic men appealing. The original eau de locker room was apparently quite the aphrodisiac. That said, chronic body odor was still stigmatized, particularly if it resulted from poor hygiene rather than honest labor. The solution? Perfumes, perfumed oils, and more perfumes, creating a unique olfactory experience that combined human musk with overpowering floral and spicy scents. Attitudes toward bodily functions were considerably more relaxed than in our euphemism-laden society. Farting, belching, and other emissions weren't hidden behind closed doors or discussed in hushed tones. Greek comedy, particularly the works of Aristophanes, is filled with scatological humor that would make even the crudest modern comedian blush. Public discussion of digestion and evacuation was perfectly acceptable dinner conversation. Imagine debating the quality of your most recent bowel movement over appetizers at a dinner party today, and you'll understand just how different social norms were. How's your digestion lately, Glaucon? Mine's been extraordinary, solid as a rock and regular as the sunrise. Ancient Greek medicine had some surprisingly effective treatments for common hygiene-related ailments. For fungal infections, they applied copper compounds that actually do have antifungal properties. For lice, they used herbs with insecticidal properties, along with the ever-popular manual removal. However, their understanding of disease transmission was limited by the lack of germ theory. They believed illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This led to treatments like bloodletting for fever, which generally made things worse. "You've got too much blood, that's your problem," was apparently considered sound medical advice, delivered by a physician who had probably never washed his hands. Bathing technology evolved throughout ancient Greek history. Early Greeks likely bathed in rivers, streams, and the sea, but by the classical period, indoor bathing facilities began to appear in homes of the wealthy. These ranged from simple hip baths, essentially large basins you would sit in, to more elaborate shower systems where water was poured from overhead. Public bath houses became increasingly sophisticated, though they never reached the engineering heights of later Roman baths with their hypo-cost heating systems. The Greeks preferred cold to lukewarm water for bathing, believing it strengthened the constitution, a preference that probably had more to do with the challenges of heating large quantities of water than any health philosophy. For the majority of Greeks who didn't have access to private bathing facilities, staying clean meant visiting public baths or bathhouses. These weren't just utilitarian facilities, but social spaces where news was exchanged, business deals were struck, and community bonds were strengthened. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of a combination spa/coffee shop/networking event, just with more nudity and less Wi-Fi. Women typically had designated bathing times separate from men, or in wealthier households, might bathe at home with water carried in by slaves or servants. The amount of water needed for a proper bath was substantial, meaning that frequent full-body bathing was a luxury not available to everyone. The level of access to clean water varied dramatically depending on where you lived in ancient Greece. Major cities like Athens had impressive water systems with fountains, wells, and aqueducts bringing fresh water from outside the city. Remote villages might rely on a single community well or nearby stream. The quality of your hygiene was directly tied to your water access, creating yet another divide between urban and rural citizens, rich and poor. Water carriers were common in cities, delivering fresh water to homes for a fee. An early version of the water delivery service, minus the cooler and tiny paper cups. 2 drachmas for a jug of water? Highway robbery, complained ancient Athenians, establishing a tradition of complaining about utility prices that continues to this day. Traveling presented special hygiene challenges. Greek sailors on long voyages had limited fresh water for bathing, often going weeks without a proper wash. Travelers on land might stop at natural springs or rivers to bathe, or if lucky, find inns with bathing facilities. Wealthy travelers might bring slaves whose sole purpose was to help maintain their master's hygiene on the road. Military campaigns were particularly notorious for poor hygiene conditions, with thousands of men camping together with minimal sanitation. The results were predictable. Disease often killed more soldiers than enemy weapons. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world without ever experiencing the joy of antibacterial hand sanitizer, a fact that makes his accomplishments even more impressive. Much of what we know about ancient Greek hygiene comes from pottery decorations, written records, and archaeological evidence. Countless vases depict bathing scenes, athletes using strigils, and other hygiene practices. These artifacts reveal that the Greeks were far more sophisticated in their approach to cleanliness than many later civilizations. The dark ages of European hygiene were still far in the future, when bathing would become associated with immorality and disease. If you could somehow transport a 5th century BCE Athenian to medieval Europe, they'd be horrified by the filth and stench. You people bathe once a year? By Zeus's shiny forehead, how do you live like this? Water supply systems in ancient Greek cities were surprisingly sophisticated, with some aqueducts and pipelines that would impress even modern engineers. The Pisistratian Aqueduct in Athens, built in the 6th century BCE, brought water from Mount Hymettus to the city center. In Syracuse, the Galermi Aqueduct, constructed under Gelon's rule, carried water for miles through carefully calculated gradients. These systems weren't just functional, but often beautiful, terminating in ornate public fountains where citizens could collect water. The management of water resources was considered so important that some cities had officials specifically responsible for maintaining these systems. Ancient water utility managers who probably received just as many complaints as their modern counterparts. Public fountains were the ancient equivalent of convenience stores, places where people gathered to collect water, socialize, and exchange gossip. These fountains were often decorated with sculptures of water deities or mythological scenes, turning a utilitarian structure into a work of art. Women were typically responsible for water collection, carrying heavy clay hydria, water jugs, on their heads or shoulders back to their homes. This daily water gathering routine created a social space primarily for women in an otherwise male-dominated public sphere. Imagine your water cooler gossip session, but outdoors, with heavy pottery instead of plastic cups, and with the constant awareness that you might be interrupting a minor deity who decided to take a dip. Water quality was a concern even in ancient times, though the Greeks didn't understand bacteria or microscopic contaminants. They judged water quality by its taste, clarity, smell, and source. Spring water was generally preferred over river water, and certain springs were famous for their especially pure or sweet-tasting water. Some Greeks believed that specific water sources had healing properties, leading to the establishment of healing sanctuaries near these springs. Water from silver mines was considered particularly healthful due to its mineral content, which is actually somewhat scientifically sound given silver's antimicrobial properties. Without water treatment facilities, waterborne diseases were common, especially in densely populated areas where waste disposal contaminated water sources. The Greeks had strong opinions about bathing frequency. Daily bathing was considered excessive by some, while others advocated for it as essential to good health. Plato suggested that rural folk who performed physical labor needed to bathe more frequently than urban intellectuals, a perspective that probably made symposiums rather fragrant affairs. Most Greeks likely fell somewhere in the middle, with full-body bathing occurring several times a week, supplemented by daily washing of hands, feet, and face. Excessive attention to personal appearance and hygiene could actually damage a man's reputation, as it suggested effeminacy and vanity. Real men don't need to bathe daily, some ancient Greek alpha male probably declared, while everyone around him subtly took a step back. Religious rituals often incorporated elements of purification and cleansing. Before entering a temple or participating in religious ceremonies, Greeks would wash their hands and sometimes their entire bodies. Some sanctuaries had special purification areas with basins of holy water. This religious emphasis on purity reinforced the cultural value placed on cleanliness. The connection between physical cleanliness and spiritual purity created a powerful incentive for hygiene practices beyond mere health concerns. Being dirty wasn't just unhygienic. It could potentially offend the gods. Talk about pressure to shower regularly. Your stink might not just offend your friends, but could actually anger Zeus himself. Medical approaches to hygiene in ancient Greece were a fascinating mix of practical wisdom and complete nonsense. Physicians like Hippocrates recognized the importance of cleanliness in healing, with some medical texts recommending that doctors wash their hands before examining patients. A revolutionary concept that would be forgotten for the next couple thousand years. However, these same respected healers might prescribe therapeutic vomiting to cleanse the system, or diagnose illness by examining the color of your urine, stool, or phlegm. In fairness, Modern doctors still ask about your bowel movements. They just don't expect you to bring in samples for their personal inspection. Medical progress is all about boundaries, people. Wounds were cleaned with wine, which actually makes scientific sense since alcohol kills bacteria, though the Greeks had no concept of germ theory. They just knew that wounds washed with wine were less likely to fester and rot. Other wound treatments included honey, also antibacterial, and various herbal poultices. Some physicians recommended urine for cleaning wounds, which is less ideal but still contains ammonia and might be better than nothing in a pinch. Surgery was performed with bronze instruments that were sometimes cleaned between procedures, sometimes not. Anesthesia consisted primarily of getting the patient drunk on wine or hitting them over the head. Medical tourism was popular, with healing sanctuaries like Epidaurus drawing visitors from across the Greek world. Let's talk about parasites, the uninvited roommates of ancient bodies. Intestinal worms were so common that they were considered a normal part of life. Treatments included consuming crushed pomegranate root, which contains compounds that actually do help expel worms. Lice and fleas were combated with vinegar rinses, special combs, and herbal repellents with varying effectiveness. Archaeological evidence from ancient Greek sites shows that intestinal parasites were nearly universal, affecting rich and poor alike. Even the most fastidious ancient Greek was likely hosting a diverse ecosystem of uninvited guests in their digestive tract and hair. The next time you complain about your apartment's insect problem, remember that at least your unwanted roommates aren't literally living inside your body. Public health initiatives in some Greek cities were surprisingly forward-thinking. Drainage systems kept streets from becoming complete cesspools after rain, and some cities had public officials responsible for maintaining cleanliness in marketplaces and public spaces. In Athens, street cleaning was sometimes performed by public slaves, though the standards would horrify modern urbanites. Waste management consisted largely of designated dumping areas outside city walls, and laws prohibiting the disposal of waste in certain areas. Without garbage collection services, waste accumulated in piles that attracted vermin and created lovely aromas that wafted through neighborhoods on warm summer days. The ancient Greek version of taking out the trash often meant literally throwing it out your window or door onto the street. Speaking of vermin, rodent control was a constant battle in ancient Greek households. Cats weren't yet the domestic pest controllers they would later become, though some Greeks did keep them for this purpose. More commonly, small dogs, ferrets, or weasels were kept to hunt mice and rats. Various traps and poisons were also employed, though these came with obvious risks to children and other household members. The presence of rodents wasn't just a cleanliness issue, but a practical one. These unwanted guests consumed precious food stores and spread disease. The mythological connection between Apollo and mice suggests the prevalence of the problem. A god associated with both plague and healing had rodents as one of his symbols. Even divine intervention was sought for what was essentially a sanitation problem. Household cleaning was primarily women's work, unless the family was wealthy enough to own slaves. Floors were typically packed earth, stone, or mosaic in wealthier homes, and were cleaned by sweeping with crude brooms made of bound twigs or branches. Spills were absorbed with rags or sand, then swept away. Dishes were washed with water and sometimes sand or ash as an abrasive cleaning agent. Wood furniture was polished with olive oil, while metal objects were cleaned with vinegar or other acidic substances to remove tarnish. Without vacuum cleaners, dishwashers, or even running water, keeping a home clean was a constant, labor-intensive process. Spring cleaning wasn't an annual event, but a daily necessity in a world where dust, ash from cooking fires, and the general grime of pre-industrial life accumulated with relentless persistence. The kitchen was a particularly challenging area for hygiene. Cooking was done over open fires, leaving everything coated in a fine layer of soot and grease. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant concern. Meat was typically consumed quickly after slaughter, while other foods were preserved through drying, salting, smoking, or pickling. Bugs were an accepted part of stored grains and legumes. Women would sift flour before using it to remove the most visible insects. But completely bug-free food was an impossible dream. Food poisoning must have been remarkably common, though the Greeks would have attributed such illness to imbalanced humors rather than bacterial contamination. The next time you complain about cleaning your kitchen, remember that you're not scrubbing soot off every surface while simultaneously picking weevils out of your flour. Food preparation surfaces were typically wood or stone, both of which are difficult to sanitize completely even with modern cleaning products. Without understanding bacteria, the concept of cross-contamination didn't exist. The same knife might be used for raw meat and then vegetables without being properly cleaned in between. Hands were washed with water, but without antibacterial soap. This provided limited protection. Despite these challenges, some food safety practices did exist. The Greeks understood that certain foods could make you sick if not properly prepared, even if they didn't understand why. Cooking utensils were typically made of wood, pottery, or metal, with wooden tools being particularly problematic from a sanitation perspective. The porous surface of wood harbors bacteria in a way that would make a modern food safety inspector faint dead away. Infant and child care presented unique hygiene challenges. Babies were swaddled tightly in cloth that was changed infrequently by modern standards. These swaddling clothes would be soiled regularly, creating a perfect environment for rashes and skin infections. Without disposable diapers, parents used a combination of cloth wrappings and, when possible, holding infants away from themselves when they sensed a bowel movement was imminent, an early form of elimination communication born of absolute necessity rather than philosophical parenting choices. Children were expected to learn proper hygiene habits early, including hand washing before meals and after using toilet facilities. The rate of infant mortality was staggeringly high, with infection being a leading cause, a tragic consequence of limited understanding of sanitation and hygiene in childcare. Textile cleaning and care was primarily women's work and incredibly labor-intensive. Without washing machines or dryers, laundry was done by hand in rivers, streams, or large vessels within the home. Garments were soaked, pounded with wooden tools, scrubbed with natron, a natural mineral salt, or fuller's earth, a clay-like substance, rinsed, and then laid out to dry in the sun. The sun's UV rays actually helped disinfect and bleach the fabric, an early form of environmentally friendly cleaning. Woolen garments were rarely washed with water, as this caused shrinkage and felting. Instead, they were aired out, beaten to remove dust, and spot cleaned as needed. The ancient Greek version of dry cleaning involved using absorbent clays to soak up oils and dirt from delicate fabrics. Water storage and purification methods were surprisingly sophisticated. Water was typically stored in large ceramic pithoi storage jars, where sediment could settle to the bottom. Some Greeks would add wine to their water, which helped kill some pathogens, though they didn't understand the science behind this practice. Boiling water was uncommon, except for cooking purposes. Rainwater was collected from rooftops and stored for use, often preferred for its purity compared to well water in urban areas. Some wealthy homes had elaborate cistern systems for collecting and storing rainwater. Without understanding microbial contamination, the Greeks judged water quality primarily by clarity, taste, and smell, standards that might miss deadly but invisible pathogens lurking in seemingly clean water. Seasonal variations greatly affected hygiene practices. Summer brought increased body odor and faster food spoilage, while winter made frequent bathing less appealing and more logistically challenging. During hot weather, Greeks might bathe more frequently, particularly those living near the coast who could easily access the sea. The Mediterranean climate, with its hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, shaped hygiene practices in ways that would be unfamiliar to those living in more extreme climates. Clothing was adapted seasonally, with lighter garments in summer allowing for better air circulation and sweat evaporation, nature's air conditioning. Winter brought heavier wool garments that were less frequently washed, meaning that by springtime, everyone was probably more than ready to shed their winter layers in more ways than one. The Greek symposium, a male drinking party that was a central social institution, presented its own hygiene challenges. These events involve reclining on couches while eating and drinking, often to excess. Vomiting was not uncommon, either intentionally induced to allow for more consumption or as an inevitable consequence of overindulgence. Dedicated vessels for this purpose, called rhytons, have been found at archaeological sites, essentially ancient Greek puke buckets. Slaves would be responsible for cleaning up bodily fluids and food waste during and after these events. Hand washing was practiced before the symposium began, with scented water provided for guests to cleanse their hands. The combination of alcohol, close quarters, and relaxed inhibitions probably made these gatherings significantly more aromatic as the night progressed. Social status was clearly reflected in hygiene practices and access. Wealthy citizens had private bathing facilities, slaves to carry water and assist with personal grooming, and the leisure time to devote to cleanliness. They could afford imported perfumes, cosmetics, and fine combs and brushes. Poor citizens relied on public facilities, bathed less frequently due to the labor involved in carrying water, and used simpler, locally available substances for cleaning. Slaves often had the worst hygiene conditions, though those working in wealthy households might have better access to bathing facilities than poor free citizens. The idea that you could assess someone's social standing by their smell wasn't just a classist assumption. It reflected the very real hygiene divide between socioeconomic levels. Money couldn't buy happiness in ancient Greece, but it could definitely buy you a better-smelling existence. Disease outbreaks regularly ravaged Greek cities, with the plague of Athens in 430 to 426 BCE being perhaps the most famous example. This epidemic killed an estimated one-third of the population, including the statesman Pericles. Thucydides provided a detailed account of the symptoms and spread of the disease, noting that physicians were particularly vulnerable due to their contact with the sick. Without understanding germ theory, the Greeks attributed such outbreaks to miasma, bad air, divine punishment, or imbalanced humors. Some of their preventative measures, such as isolating the sick and maintaining general cleanliness, were actually effective even if based on incorrect theories. Others, like burning aromatic substances to purify the air, did little to address the actual causes of disease spread. Religious purification rituals intertwined with practical hygiene in fascinating ways. Before entering temples or participating in sacred ceremonies, Greeks would wash their hands or sometimes their entire bodies as a symbol of spiritual cleanliness. Some sanctuaries had special fountains or basins specifically for ritual purification. During certain festivals, such as the Thesmophoria honoring Demeter, women were required to maintain specific states of ritual purity, which included sexual abstinence and special bathing rituals. These religious practices reinforced the importance of physical cleanliness in Greek culture, creating a society where personal hygiene had both practical and spiritual dimensions. The gods, apparently, preferred devotees who didn't stink, a theological position that makes perfect sense when you're imagining deities who can smell you from Mount Olympus. Birth and death, the bookends of human existence, were surrounded by specific hygiene practices. Childbirth typically occurred at home with the assistance of a midwife and female relatives. The birthing area would be cleaned beforehand, though without antiseptics or understanding of bacterial infection. Puerperal fever, infection following childbirth, was a common cause of maternal death. After birth, both mother and baby would be washed, with the first bath of a newborn having ritual significance. Death similarly involved washing the deceased body before dressing it for funeral rites. This task was typically performed by female relatives. The act of washing the dead wasn't just practical, but symbolic, a final act of care preparing the deceased for their journey to the underworld. These intimate hygiene practices around the beginning and end of life were primarily women's domain, creating rituals that bound communities together through shared experience. Physical appearance and personal grooming were strongly connected to Greek concepts of arete, excellence, or virtue, and kalokagathia, being beautiful and good. A well-maintained body reflected a well-ordered mind and moral character. Athletic training was seen as developing both physical beauty and ethical virtue, the famous Greek ideal of a sound mind and a sound body. This philosophical connection between external appearance and internal virtue created social pressure to maintain certain hygiene standards. However, excessive attention to appearance could also be criticized as vanity or effeminacy, particularly in men. The ideal was moderation, clean and well-groomed, but not obsessively so. Finding this balance was part of the broader Greek philosophical quest for the perfect mean between extremes. Yes, I spent 3 hours on my hair today, but it was in pursuit of philosophical excellence, was probably the ancient Greek equivalent of, I'm not shallow, I'm just practicing self-care. Regional variations in hygiene practices across the Greek world were significant. Spartans were known for their austere approach to personal care, emphasizing functionality over aesthetics. Spartan men kept their hair long, contrary to Athenian fashion, but maintained it simply without elaborate styling. Their focus on military training meant daily exercise followed by cold water bathing in the Eurotas River. No heated bathhouses for these warriors. In contrast, colonies in Asia Minor were influenced by Eastern bathing traditions, developing more elaborate bathing facilities and practices. Corinth, with its reputation for luxury, embraced perfumes and cosmetics to a greater degree than other city-states. These regional differences became points of cultural pride and mutual mockery. You bathe like a Spartan wasn't a compliment, but a suggestion that someone's hygiene was overly simplistic and severe. The Greek attitude towards sweat varied dramatically depending on context. Athletic sweat was considered honorable, evidence of exertion and discipline. The gymnasium even had a specific term for the mixture of oil, dust, and sweat that accumulated on athletes' bodies, gloios. This substance was actually collected and sold for medicinal purposes, believed to have healing properties due to its association with youth and vigor. Conversely, sweat from fear, gluttony, or illness was considered shameful and unclean. The Greeks believed that different types of sweat had different odors reflecting the cause. A surprisingly perceptive observation, given that stress sweat actually does smell different from exercise sweat due to different gland involvement. Context is everything. One man's dignified athletic perspiration was another man's disgusting nervous flop sweat. Attitudes toward body hair removed any possibility of confusion about Greek beauty standards. For women, a completely hairless body was the ideal. They used pumice stones, tweezers, and depilatory creams containing caustic substances like quicklime and arsenic to achieve this look. For men, the situation was more complicated. Regular men typically embraced their body hair as a sign of masculinity, while athletes and young men often removed it. The gymnasium actually gets its name from the Greek word gymnos, meaning naked, highlighting how central the hairless, nude male form was to Greek athletic culture. Body hair removal was so important that it created an entire profession. The paratiltria, women who specialized in hair removal for other women. Imagine making your living plucking other people's body hair all day, every day, truly a career path that required strong eyesight and stronger stomach. Breath freshening was serious business in a culture where face-to-face conversation and debate were central social activities. Without toothpaste or mouthwash, Greeks relied on chewing aromatic herbs like parsley, mint, and anise seeds to combat halitosis. Wine was sometimes used as a mouth rinse, which probably helped kill some bacteria while simultaneously replacing bad breath with wine breath, a debatable improvement. Some Greeks would chew mastic gum, harvested from the resin of mastic trees native to the island of Chios. This natural gum not only freshened breath, but has mild antibacterial properties, making it one of the more effective oral hygiene methods available. The wealthy might use mouth rinses containing herbs steeped in wine or vinegar, ancient Listerine that probably burned like fire, but left your breath smelling like a peculiar combination of a vineyard and an herb garden. Personal hygiene tools were valuable possessions often passed down through generations. Combs were typically made of wood, bone, or ivory, with 2 sets of teeth. one side with wider spacing for detangling, the other with finer teeth for removing lice and their eggs. Mirrors were polished metal discs, typically bronze, providing a less than perfect reflection but sufficient for basic grooming. Tweezers, ear picks, and nail cleaners were often combined into a single multi-tool attached to a ring, the ancient Greek equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, focused entirely on grooming needs. These tools were not just utilitarian, but often beautifully decorated, turning necessary hygiene implements into personal expressions of status and taste. Archaeologists have found elaborately carved combs and ornate mirror handles that suggest their owners saw these items as both functional tools and status symbols. Fishing was an important source of food, but it also provided unexpected hygiene applications. Fish sauce, garum, a fermented condiment made from fish intestines and salt, was used not only in cooking but also as a treatment for wounds and skin conditions due to its salt content. The Hippocratic Corpus recommends certain fish oils for treating skin diseases, a practice that has some scientific basis given the anti-inflammatory properties of omega-3 fatty acids found in fish oil. Other marine resources used for hygiene included sea sponges for bathing and personal cleaning, and crushed seashells mixed with honey as an exfoliating face scrub. Next time you pay exorbitant prices for that sea salt scrub at a fancy spa, remember you're participating in a beauty tradition that dates back to ancient fishmongers who probably smelled terrible themselves. Sleep hygiene existed conceptually if not by name. Greeks typically slept on wooden beds with woven rope or leather straps supporting wool or linen mattresses stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers for the wealthy. These mattresses were breeding grounds for bedbugs, fleas, and other parasites, requiring regular airing in the sun and beating to remove some of the unwanted inhabitants. Wealthier homes might use herbs like lavender or mint scattered among bedding to repel insects, a pleasant-smelling but only moderately effective pest control method. Without modern laundering, bedding accumulated skin cells, sweat, and various bodily fluids, creating a microscopic ecosystem that doesn't bear too much contemplation. The ancient Greek version of counting sheep might well have been counting bedbugs, though unlike sheep, the bugs weren't imaginary. Urban planning in some Greek cities took hygiene considerations into account, though not always successfully. Streets were designed with slight slopes to allow rainwater to wash away accumulated waste, nature's street cleaning service. Public fountains were strategically placed throughout cities to provide access to clean water. In some cases, public toilets were positioned where waste could be carried away by existing water channels. However, these systems were far from universal, and many Greek cities grew organically without central planning, resulting in narrow, winding streets that became muddy, waste-filled nightmares during rainy seasons. Archaeological evidence from urban centers like Athens shows that despite some planning efforts, the reality of daily life included streets containing layers of compacted waste, broken pottery, food remnants, and animal droppings, the unglamorous side of classical civilization that doesn't make it into the museum exhibits. Hospitality customs included hygiene rituals that would be familiar to modern luxury hotel guests, minus the tiny shampoo bottles. When guests arrived at a Greek home, slaves would provide water for hand washing and sometimes foot washing, particularly welcome after traveling dusty roads in open sandals. This wasn't just politeness, but practical necessity in a world without paved roads or closed footwear. For important guests, scented oils might be offered for anointing after bathing. These guest-oriented hygiene practices were considered essential elements of xenia, hospitality, the sacred obligation to care for travelers. The customs served both practical and social functions, cleaning the guest while also marking the transition from outsider to welcomed visitor. Today's luxury hotels are really just formalizing a hospitality tradition that ancient Greeks would immediately recognize, though they might be confused by the purpose of those little shower caps. Exercise and hygiene were inseparably linked in Greek culture, particularly for men. Daily visits to the gymnasium involved not just physical training, but a complete grooming routine. The typical sequence involved exercise, followed by sweating in a dry heat room, similar to a modern sauna, oil application, scraping with strigils, and finally bathing. This process was as much about social bonding and status display as physical cleanliness. Young men were taught proper gymnasium hygiene as part of their education, learning the complex social codes around nudity, personal space, and appropriate behavior in this all-male environment. For the Greeks, staying fit and staying clean were complementary aspects of the same cultural value system, emphasizing bodily excellence. The modern gym bro taking endless selfies in the locker room mirror is essentially participating in a tradition that goes back 2,500 years, just with better lighting and fewer philosophical discussions. Old age brought specific hygiene challenges that the Greeks addressed with varying degrees of success. Elderly people who could no longer easily visit public baths relied on sponge baths at home, often with the assistance of slaves or family members. Incontinence was managed with absorbent cloth pads and frequent clothing changes, a burden that fell heavily on female caretakers. Dental problems were particularly acute for the elderly, with tooth loss a near-universal experience. Artificial teeth made of bone, wood, or taken from animals or even other humans were available to the wealthy, though these crude prosthetics were more for appearance than functionality. Greeks recognized the increased susceptibility of the elderly to illness and recommended more frequent hand washing and careful food preparation for older individuals. The concept of elder care included attention to hygiene needs, though the quality of this care varied dramatically based on social status and family resources. Military campaigns created some of the worst hygiene conditions in the Greek world. Armies on the move typically followed rivers when possible, providing water for drinking and basic washing. However, thousands of men camping together with minimal sanitation infrastructure created predictable problems. Greek military leaders understood the connection between camp cleanliness and troop health, establishing basic sanitation rules, such as designating specific areas for human waste away from water sources and cooking areas. Despite these efforts, disease often spread rapidly through military camps, sometimes killing more soldiers than enemy weapons. Alexander the Great's campaigns across Asia were as much a triumph over sanitation challenges as military ones. Maintaining troop hygiene across diverse climates and terrain while constantly moving was a logistical achievement that rivals his tactical brilliance. The finest military mind in the ancient world was regularly concerned with where his soldiers were relieving themselves, a detail omitted from most glorious battle accounts. Ship hygiene presented unique challenges in a seafaring culture. Greek triremes, warships powered by 170 rowers arranged in 3 tiers, were essentially floating hygiene disasters. Men rowed in shifts, but the ships had no dedicated toilet facilities, meaning rowers likely used buckets or simply the sea itself when possible. The confined space, physical exertion, and minimal opportunities for bathing created conditions that must have been olfactorily overwhelming. Merchant vessels weren't much better, though their smaller crews created somewhat less concentrated misery. Fresh water was a precious commodity on ships, used primarily for drinking rather than washing. Marine archaeology has revealed fascinating hygiene artifacts from shipwrecks, including personal grooming tools that suggest sailors attempted to maintain some standards of cleanliness despite challenging conditions. The romantic image of ancient mariners gazing thoughtfully at the horizon takes on a different quality when you consider they were probably doing so while marinating in their own accumulated filth. Clothing styles reflected practical hygiene considerations in the Mediterranean climate. Greek garments were typically made of rectangular pieces of fabric draped around the body rather than fitted clothing requiring complex sewing. This simplified cleaning and allowed for adjustments based on temperature. The light, loose-fitting clothing allowed for air circulation, reducing sweat accumulation in the hot climate. White or light-colored fabric showed dirt clearly, encouraging regular cleaning, while also reflecting sunlight to keep the wearer cooler. Most garments were made of wool or linen, with linen preferred for undergarments due to its smoother texture and better absorption properties. Without elastic, zippers, buttons, or even safety pins. Greek clothing was secured with decorative pins and belts that frequently needed readjustment. Wardrobe malfunctions were likely a common occurrence. The famous Greek draped look wasn't just an aesthetic choice, but a practical adaptation to both climate and cleaning technology limitations. Philosophers had plenty to say about hygiene, because Greek philosophers had opinions on literally everything. Diogenes the Cynic rejected conventional hygiene altogether, embracing filth as a rejection of social norms and supposedly masturbating publicly because he saw no reason for shame about natural bodily functions. At the other extreme, Pythagoreans followed strict cleanliness rules as part of their religious practices, including specific guidelines about when and how to bathe. Aristotle took a moderate position, advocating for appropriate cleanliness without excessive attention to appearance. Plato discussed the cleansing of both body and soul, seeing physical purification as a metaphor for moral improvement. These philosophical perspectives shaped cultural attitudes toward hygiene, creating an intellectual framework that elevated mundane bathing and grooming routines to expressions of broader values and beliefs. Only the Greeks could turn "should I take a bath today?" into a profound philosophical question requiring extensive debate in the Agora. Archaeological evidence provides fascinating glimpses into ancient hygiene practices. Excavations of homes reveal bathing areas, drainage systems, and sometimes even primitive toilet facilities. Personal grooming tools like combs, mirrors, and strigils are common finds in both residential areas and graves, suggesting their importance as personal possessions. Analysis of dental calculus, mineralized plaque, from Greek skeletons has revealed evidence of oral hygiene practices, including plant fibers that may indicate the use of primitive toothbrushes or chewing sticks. Coprolite studies, analysis of preserved feces, provide information about diet, parasitic infections, and digestive health. Residue analysis from pottery has identified substances used as soaps, perfumes, and cosmetics. Together, these archaeological findings create a more complete picture of daily hygiene practices than written sources alone, revealing both the sophistication and limitations of ancient Greek approaches to cleanliness. The legacy of Greek hygiene practices influenced subsequent civilizations, particularly the Romans, who elaborated on Greek bathing culture to create their famous bath complexes. The Greek understanding of the connection between cleanliness and health informed medical practices for centuries, even as specific theories about humoral balance were eventually disproven. The cultural emphasis on the clean, well-maintained body as a reflection of moral character became embedded in Western philosophical traditions. Even the Greek habit of athletic nudity influenced later artistic representations of the idealized human form. Perhaps most significantly, the concept of public hygiene as a civic responsibility, evident in Greek water systems, public baths, and waste management efforts, established a precedent for community infrastructure supporting public health. When modern cities build water treatment plants or public pools, they're participating in a tradition with roots in ancient Greek civic priorities. When we compare ancient Greek hygiene practices to those of their contemporaries, they actually come out looking pretty good. The Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness, but took it to extremes, including removing all body hair and applying elaborate cosmetics that probably did more harm than good. The Persians had sophisticated bathing customs, but believed touching dead bodies or menstruating women made one ritually unclean. Meanwhile, the Celtic and Germanic tribes to the north were considerably less concerned with regular bathing, though they did have their own methods of grooming and cleaning. The Greeks occupied a middle ground, clean enough to avoid major disease outbreaks most of the time, but not so obsessed with purity that it became a full-time occupation. Being the birthplace of Western civilization apparently required hitting the sweet spot between acceptably clean and not spending half your day on hygiene rituals. Climate played a crucial role in shaping Greek hygiene practices. The Mediterranean environment, with hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, created specific challenges and opportunities. The heat made body odor a more pressing concern, but also made cold water bathing refreshing rather than tortuous. The abundant sunshine served as a natural disinfectant for clothing and bedding laid out to dry. Olive trees thrived in this climate, providing the essential oil used in everything from cooking to cleaning to personal grooming. The relative scarcity of fresh water in many areas, particularly during summer months, necessitated careful water management and influenced bathing frequency. Without air conditioning, deodorant, or refrigeration, adapting to seasonal changes was essential for maintaining even basic comfort levels, let alone cleanliness standards. Gendered aspects of hygiene were pronounced, reflecting broader social divisions. Women were responsible for maintaining household cleanliness, washing clothing, and preparing food safely. All critical but undervalued hygiene work. They were also expected to maintain higher personal cleanliness standards than men, particularly regarding body hair and odor. Men's hygiene was more public and social, centered around gymnasium culture and public baths. While men could exercise and sweat publicly, women's physical exertion and resultant perspiration were largely confined to private spaces. The double standard extended to body odor. A certain amount of masculine musk was acceptable or even attractive, while female body odor was uniformly condemned. Some aspects of ancient gender politics are unfortunately timeless. Women were simultaneously expected to appear naturally beautiful while concealing the considerable effort this required. Ancient Greek attitudes toward bodily fluids would make modern sensibilities quiver. Urine was considered useful for everything from laundry to teeth whitening to wound cleaning, thanks to its ammonia content. Blood was carefully observed for medical diagnostics, but generally considered impure, particularly menstrual blood, which was surrounded by superstition and taboo. Semen was associated with vitality and life force, leading to various beliefs about conserving or properly directing this precious fluid. Early versions of theories that continue to circulate in certain corners of the internet today. Breast milk was recognized for its nutritional value, but also used in various medical treatments for adults. Tears, sweat, saliva, each had its own cultural associations and perceived properties. The Greeks were simultaneously more practical and more superstitious about bodily fluids than modern society, using them as resources when useful while also attributing mystical properties to them. Marine resources played surprising roles in hygiene practices. Sea sponges were harvested and used for bathing, household cleaning, and even as tampons and toilet paper. Various types of seaweed were incorporated into beauty treatments, while salt water itself was believed to have healing properties for skin conditions. Crushed seashells served as abrasives for cleaning everything from floors to teeth. Even fish organs found hygienic applications, with certain fish gallbladders used in soap making and fish oils applied to treat skin conditions. Coastal communities had significant advantages in hygiene resources, with ready access to these marine materials, as well as salt for preservation and cleaning. The Mediterranean wasn't just a source of food and transportation, but a vast repository of hygiene supplies. Nature's drugstore for the cleanliness-conscious Greek. Hygiene knowledge was passed down through generations via practical instruction rather than formal education. Mothers taught daughters household management skills, including cleaning techniques, food safety practices, and personal grooming. Fathers or older male relatives instructed boys in appropriate gymnasium etiquette and bathing protocols. This gender knowledge transmission reinforced social divisions while ensuring cultural continuity in hygiene practices. Medical knowledge, including hygiene-related treatments, was more formalized, typically taught through apprenticeship systems where students learned by observing experienced physicians. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical texts from around the 5th to 4th centuries BCE, included significant sections on hygiene and preventative medicine, representing one of the earliest systematic approaches to the relationship between cleanliness and health. Knowledge transfer was fundamentally shaped by who was deemed appropriate to know what, creating gendered hygiene practices that persisted for millennia. Occupational hygiene varied dramatically based on profession. Metal workers faced particular challenges from soot, smoke, and metal dust, often developing characteristic discolorations or lung diseases. Tanners working with animal hides used urine and dung in their processes, creating such offensive odors that tanneries were typically located outside city walls. Fishmongers and butchers contended with blood, scales, and offal, requiring frequent washing that made their skin chronically dry and cracked. Farmers, despite working outdoors, accumulated layers of dust and animal waste that marked them visibly as rural laborers. Potters had perpetually clay-stained hands and clothes. These occupational markers served as visible class indicators, with clean hands becoming shorthand for higher social status and indoor intellectual work. The phrase dirty jobs wasn't just metaphorical. Certain occupations literally made cleanliness nearly impossible to maintain. The gymnasium culture, so central to Greek male life, had significant hygiene dimensions beyond the obvious bathing facilities. The word gymnasium derives from gymnos, meaning naked, highlighting how central nudity was to this institution. Exercising nude eliminated sweaty clothing while allowing for complete application of oil and thorough cleaning afterward. The gymnasium typically included several hygiene areas. The alliopterion, where oil was applied before exercise, the conisterion, where fine dust was applied over the oil to regulate temperature and provide grip for wrestling, the lautron for washing, and sometimes a steam room or dry heat room. This elaborate infrastructure demonstrates how intertwined physical fitness, social interaction, and hygiene were in Greek male culture. The modern gym shower facilities are but a pale shadow of these comprehensive ancient grooming spaces. Literary references to hygiene provide fascinating glimpses into cultural attitudes. Homer's Odyssey includes several bathing scenes highlighting hospitality customs, where guests are bathed and anointed with oil by female servants. Greek comedy frequently used scatological humor and hygiene-based insults, with Aristophanes' plays particularly rich in bathroom jokes and references to bodily functions. Medical texts detail proper hygiene for both patients and physicians, while philosophical works debate appropriate levels of attention to personal appearance. These literary representations reveal the omnipresence of hygiene concerns in Greek thought and social interaction. When your culture produces epic poetry featuring detailed descriptions of bathing techniques, it's safe to say cleanliness played a significant role in your cultural identity. Modern influencers posting shower routine videos are simply continuing a tradition started by Homer. Disaster response included hygiene considerations that show surprising sophistication. After earthquakes or floods, emergency measures focused on securing clean water supplies and preventing waste contamination. During disease outbreaks, some cities implemented isolation of the sick and increased attention to cleanliness, though without understanding germ theory. These efforts had limited effectiveness. Military campaigns included sanitation officers responsible for camp hygiene, recognizing that disease could decimate armies more effectively than enemy weapons. Naval vessels carried specific water supplies reserved for hygiene purposes separate from drinking water. These disaster preparedness elements reveal an understanding of how quickly hygiene conditions could deteriorate in emergencies and how critical maintaining basic cleanliness was to survival. FEMA's disaster response playbook isn't so different from what a competent Greek general would have implemented after an earthquake or during a siege. Cosmetic treatments went far beyond basic cleanliness to address cultural beauty standards. Women applied white lead to their faces to achieve the coveted pale complexion that signified indoor living and higher social status, slowly poisoning themselves in the process. Red ochre or mulberry juice provided cheek color, while kohl, a paste made from ground antimony or charred almonds, defined eyes. Men weren't exempt from vanity, using oils and waxes to style hair and beards. Both sexes might use pumice stones to smooth rough skin, honey masks for complexion, and various depilatories for unwanted hair. Wealthy Greeks imported exotic cosmetic ingredients from Egypt, Persia, and beyond, creating an ancient luxury beauty market not unlike today's high-end cosmetic industry. The specific products have changed, But the fundamental human desire to look better than nature intended remains remarkably consistent across millennia. Archaeological discoveries at sites like the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus reveal sophisticated approaches to healing that incorporated hygiene principles. These healing centers combined religious rituals with practical medical treatments, featuring sacred springs for purification, dream incubation spaces, and various bathing facilities. The site design included advanced water management systems, with separate channels for clean and wastewater, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of contamination principles. The Asclepian on the island of Kos, associated with Hippocrates, similarly combined religious healing with practical hygiene measures. These healing sanctuaries attracted visitors from across the Greek world seeking cures for various ailments, creating early versions of medical tourism. The integration of spiritual and physical cleansing at these sites reflects the holistic Greek approach to health that recognized connections between mind, body, and environment. Now let's fast forward to modern times and consider what the ancient Greeks would think of our hygiene practices. They'd be simultaneously impressed and horrified. Indoor plumbing would seem like divine magic, water appearing at the turn of a handle, hot or cold on demand, without slaves carrying heavy jugs from the fountain. Flush toilets would represent the pinnacle of civilization, private, efficient, and usually odor-free. Modern toothbrushes, toothpaste, and dental care would make them weep with envy, while antibacterial soaps and hand sanitizers would seem like sorcery. However, they'd be baffled by our obsession with eliminating all body odors, our isolation of bathing as a solitary rather than social activity, and our extreme privacy concerns around natural functions. You have all this amazing technology, they might say, yet you use it to pretend bodily functions don't exist at all. Our modern gyms would perplex ancient Greeks entirely. Where is the oil? Why is everyone wearing clothes? Why are people using machines instead of wrestling? And why is no one talking to each other? The concept of silently exercising alone while listening to private audio would seem antisocial and bizarre to people who viewed physical training as inherently communal. Our separate gendered changing rooms with individual shower stalls would seem unnecessarily prudish, while our elaborate gym etiquette, don't stare, don't talk too much, wipe down equipment, would strike them as unnecessarily complicated compared to their straightforward nudity and direct social interaction. The modern fitness culture's focus on individual achievement rather than civic development would seem selfish and missing the point of physical training altogether. Modern public health measures would impress ancient Greek physicians. The concept of treating water supplies to prevent disease, regular waste collection, and widespread vaccination against common illnesses would seem like utopian fantasies. Hippocrates would nod approvingly at hand-washing requirements for medical personnel and food service workers, while being amazed at the germ theory that explains why such practices work. The Greeks had intuited many connections between cleanliness and health, but lacked the scientific framework to fully develop these insights. However, they might find our modern disconnection from our bodies troubling. Our tendency to medicate symptoms rather than address underlying causes would strike Hippocratic physicians as treating the branch rather than the root. They might also question our environmental impact, creating massive waste problems while solving hygiene ones. Our relationship with personal grooming tools would seem excessive to ancient Greeks. The average modern bathroom contains dozens of specialized products, separate cleansers for face, body, and hair, different tools for various grooming tasks, product distinguished by gender despite having nearly identical ingredients. The Greeks managed with multipurpose olive oil, simple tools, and minimal specialized products. They'd likely see our bathroom cabinets as examples of unnecessary complexity and consumer excess. However, they'd appreciate the effectiveness of modern tools. The humble toothbrush alone would represent a quantum leap in oral hygiene. Our obsession with cleanliness as moral virtue would be familiar territory, though the specific standards have shifted dramatically. The ancient Greek might conclude we're simultaneously more advanced and more neurotic about hygiene. The globalization of the ancient world meant that hygiene products and practices crossed cultural boundaries in fascinating ways. Greeks near Egypt adopted some of their neighbors' more elaborate cosmetic techniques, while Greek colonies in Italy developed unique bathing traditions that would later influence Roman practices. Phoenician traders brought exotic perfume ingredients from far-off lands, while Persian conquest introduced Greeks to more elaborate bathing rituals. Wealthy Greeks imported luxury hygiene items like special soaps from Syria, perfumes from Egypt, and cosmetics from the East. Trade networks didn't just move goods, but ideas about cleanliness and beauty. The ancient Mediterranean was a cauldron of cultural exchange where hygiene innovations spread through trade routes, military campaigns, and colonial settlements. Even in the ancient world, beauty trends went viral, just without the Instagram tutorials. Entertainment venues had their own hygiene challenges. Greek theaters, with their stone seating accommodating thousands of spectators for day-long performances, had no dedicated toilet facilities. Audience members either held it uncomfortable during a trilogy of tragedies or missed parts of the performance. The stadium at Olympia, hosting thousands for athletic competitions, similarly lacked adequate facilities for the masses. These entertainment spaces became progressively less fragrant as the day wore on, particularly during hot weather. Vendors selling food and drink exacerbated the problem by generating additional waste. The modern complaint about long bathroom lines at concert venues seems quaint compared to the ancient Greek reality of simply finding a secluded spot behind a building. The phrase "suffering for art" took on a very literal meaning when attending a festival meant subjecting yourself to hours without bathroom access. The theater itself often incorporated hygiene themes into performances. Aristophanes' comedies are particularly rich in scatological humor and references to bodily functions, suggesting these topics reliably generated laughs from ancient audiences. His play The Clouds mocks Socrates and his students for their unwashed, unkempt appearance, while The Wasps includes jokes about incontinence in the elderly. Greek tragedy occasionally referenced purification rituals, particularly in plays dealing with blood guilt or pollution, such as Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. These theatrical representations reveal which hygiene practices were common enough to be universally understood by audiences. When playwrights needed an easy laugh, bathroom humor apparently worked just as well in 425 BCE as it does today. Some aspects of human comedy are eternal. People have always found bodily functions simultaneously necessary and hilarious. Pregnancy and childbirth involve specific hygiene practices designed to protect both mother and child in an era of high maternal and infant mortality. Pregnant women were advised to bathe regularly, but avoid very hot water, which was believed to potentially harm the fetus. As delivery approached, the birthing area would be cleaned and purified, often with smoke from aromatic herbs believed to ward off infection. During labor, women typically squatted on a birthing stool over freshly cleaned floor coverings that could be easily removed and cleaned afterward. After birth, both mother and infant were washed, with the baby's first bath having ritual significance marking their entry into the community. Midwives used vinegar or wine to clean their hands before assisting births, a practice that had genuine antiseptic benefits despite predating germ theory by millennia. Urban and rural hygiene differed dramatically based on available infrastructure. City dwellers had access to public fountains, bathhouses, and sometimes rudimentary sewage systems, but also dealt with the sanitation challenges of dense population. Rural residents had better access to natural water sources like streams and springs, more space for waste disposal, but typically lacked sophisticated bathing facilities. These differences created distinct hygiene cultures. Urban Greeks might bathe more frequently, but lived with greater ambient filth from crowded streets, while rural Greeks might bathe less often, but enjoyed cleaner air and more space between dwellings. The urban-rural divide also affected perceptions, with city folk considering rural people uncouth and dirty, while country dwellers viewed urbanites as effete and obsessed with artificial cleanliness. Some stereotypes are apparently as ancient as civilization itself. Different Greek deities were associated with various aspects of hygiene and cleanliness. Apollo, god of healing, was naturally connected to medical aspects of hygiene. Aphrodite presided over beauty practices and cosmetics. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, oversaw household cleanliness. Hygeia, whose name literally means health, was the personification of cleanliness and sanitation. Water deities like the naiads, freshwater nymphs, were honored at springs and fountains that provided essential clean water. Even Asclepius, the god of medicine, had purification rituals associated with his healing sanctuaries. This divine oversight of cleanliness demonstrates how central hygiene was to Greek religious thought. When your pantheon includes a goddess specifically dedicated to hygiene, it's clear that cleanliness ranks high in your cultural values. Modern hand-washing signs in restaurant bathrooms seem rather uninspired compared to having an actual deity monitoring your sanitation practices. Wine played surprising roles in hygiene practices beyond its obvious consumption. It was used as a mouth rinse for bad breath, a disinfectant for wounds, and mixed with water for both practical purification and ritual cleansing. The alcohol content did have genuine antibacterial properties, making wine one of the more scientifically sound aspects of Greek hygiene. Different types of wine were prescribed for different hygiene purposes. Aged wine for wound cleaning, new wine for certain skin conditions, wine from specific regions for particular medical applications. The Greeks were correct in identifying wine's usefulness in hygiene, even if they didn't understand the chemistry behind it. The next time someone judges you for that glass of red wine, you can claim you're simply participating in an ancient medicinal tradition. It's not drinking, it's preventative health care based on 2,500-year-old wisdom. Fire and smoke were considered purifying agents with both practical and ritual applications. Fumigation with aromatic herbs was used to cleanse spaces of insects, rodents, and bad odors. Newborn babies were sometimes ritually carried around the hearth fire as a form of purification and protection. Clothing might be hung near smoke to disinfect it and repel insects. In some healing contexts, passing through smoke was believed to have cleansing properties for certain ailments. While the Greeks didn't understand the science, the heat from fire and certain compounds in smoke actually do have some disinfectant properties. Their intuitive understanding of fire's purifying nature led to practices that, while wrapped in religious significance, had practical benefits. Smoke purification might sound like primitive superstition, but when your alternatives are ode to unwashed humanity, a bit of aromatic smoke starts to seem quite sophisticated. Greek awareness of vectors for disease transmission was surprisingly sophisticated despite lacking germ theory. They observed that certain illnesses spread through close contact, leading to isolation practices for the visibly sick. Some physicians recommended avoiding areas with stagnant water, recognizing the connection between such environments and disease, though they attributed this to miasma or bad air rather than mosquitoes. During plague outbreaks, some cities enacted measures like prohibiting public gatherings and encouraging increased attention to cleanliness. These intuitive public health approaches, while based on incorrect theories, sometimes proved effective in limiting disease spread. The Greeks' observational skills allowed them to develop practical disease prevention strategies even without understanding the microscopic causes. Sometimes you don't need to understand exactly why something works to benefit from doing it. Seasonal clothing changes reflected both practical hygiene and social display. Winter garments made of heavier wool were typically cleaned less frequently due to the challenges of washing and drying thick fabrics in cold, wet weather. As spring arrived, these winter garments would be thoroughly cleaned, aired, and stored with aromatic herbs to repel insects before being replaced with lighter summer clothing. The seasonal wardrobe transition was a significant household event, particularly for wealthy families with extensive clothing collections. Summer garments of lighter linen were easier to clean and allowed for better air circulation in hot weather, reducing sweat accumulation and associated odors. These seasonal adaptations represented practical responses to both climate conditions and hygiene considerations. The modern concept of spring cleaning has its roots in these ancient seasonal transitions, when warmer weather finally made thorough household cleaning possible after winter's limitations. Animal hygiene within Greek households created additional challenges. Dogs and cats kept as pets or for vermin control produced waste that needed management. Larger homes with courtyards might designate specific areas for animal relief, while smaller urban dwellings faced more complex arrangements. Working animals like donkeys, horses, and oxen created significant waste management issues in urban settings, with designated dung collectors operating in some cities. The presence of animals in living spaces introduced fleas, ticks, and other parasites that could transfer to human inhabitants. Some Greeks used herbal repellents like pennyroyal to reduce insect infestations on both animals and humans. The relationship between animal husbandry and human hygiene created cycles of contamination that were difficult to break in pre-modern settings. Even the most fastidious ancient Greek couldn't escape the hygiene challenges of living in close proximity to animals in a world without flea collars, veterinary care, or pooper scoopers. Children's hygiene education formed an important part of Greek child rearing. Boys and girls alike were taught basic cleanliness principles from an early age, though the specific practices diverged as they grew older in accordance with gender roles. Children learned by observing and assisting adults in hygiene tasks appropriate to their gender and social status. Girls helped with household cleaning and laundry, while boys learned gymnasium etiquette from older male relatives. Proper hand washing before meals was consistently enforced across gender lines. The Greeks recognized that habits formed in childhood carried into adulthood and emphasized early hygiene training. Some aspects of this educational approach remain remarkably similar today. Parents still hover over children at sinks, insisting they use soap and wash between their fingers. The specific practices have evolved, but the fundamental parental mantra of "go wash your hands" echoes across millennia. Special occupations developed around hygiene needs, creating niche markets in the ancient economy. Professional bathhouse attendants assisted with scraping, washing, and massage. Specialized launderers, primarily men, interestingly, handled cleaning for wealthy households. Perfumers created custom scents for discerning clients, while hairdressers developed elaborate styles for wealthy women. Barbers not only cut hair and trimmed beards, but sometimes performed minor medical procedures like lancing boils or pulling teeth. These hygiene specialists represented a significant sector of the service economy in larger Greek cities. The ancient Greek version of the Yellow Pages would have featured numerous hygiene-related businesses, from high-end perfumers to the guy who emptied your chamber pot for a few coins. Some enterprising individuals built entire careers around helping others stay clean, the original essential workers of the ancient world. So what does our modern world of daily showers, infinite bathroom products, and flushable everything tell us about how far we've come from our ancient Greek ancestors? If we transported a typical ancient Athenian to a modern American bathroom, they'd probably think they died and gone to Mount Olympus. Indoor plumbing alone would seem like divine magic. Clean water appearing at the turn of a handle, hot or cold on demand, without slaves carrying heavy jugs from the fountain. The toilet would represent the pinnacle of civilization, private, efficient, and usually odor-free. Our toilet paper would seem luxuriously soft compared to their sea sponges on sticks or pottery shards. The ancient Greek would likely spend hours just flushing the toilet and watching the water swirl away, marveling at this seemingly mystical technology. Our medicine cabinets would be equally mind-blowing. Specialized products for every body part and function, all in colorful packaging with scientific-sounding names. The concept of microbes would be completely foreign, so our obsession with antibacterial everything would seem like religious zealotry rather than science. You have special soap just for hands, and different soap for faces, and another kind for intimate areas, and they're all different from the soap you use on dishes. The complexity would be overwhelming to someone used to multi-purpose olive oil for everything from cooking to skincare to lamp fuel. Our specialized tools would similarly amaze. The electric toothbrush alone would seem like sorcery, while dental floss would represent a level of oral hygiene commitment beyond anything they could imagine. Deodorant would be perhaps the most culturally shocking product to our time-traveling Greek. The concept of completely eliminating body odor rather than masking it with perfume would seem bizarre and possibly unhealthy. The Greeks associated natural body scent with vitality and health. The idea of chemically preventing sweating would likely seem as strange to them as deliberately inducing fever. Our obsession with smelling like nothing at all would be particularly perplexing. You have a technology to smell like anything in the world, and you choose to smell like nothing? Where's the joy in that? They might wonder why we work so hard to erase the natural human scent when their culture used perfume to enhance rather than replace personal aroma. The privacy of modern bathrooms would represent another cultural shock. Bathing and toilet use in ancient Greece were often communal activities, combining hygiene with socialization. Our insistence on complete solitude for these functions would seem unnecessarily isolating and possibly a bit neurotic. You have entire rooms in your home dedicated solely to evacuation and cleaning, and only one person uses them at a time? What a waste of space. And how lonely. The concept of the bathroom as a private sanctuary rather than a social space would require significant cultural adjustment for our ancient visitor. They might find our bathroom habits efficient, but strangely antisocial, missing the community-building aspect of their public baths and communal toilets. Our oral hygiene would be particularly impressive to ancient Greeks, who struggled with dental problems throughout their lives. Modern toothbrushes, toothpaste, floss, and professional dental care would seem like miraculous interventions that could have saved them considerable pain and tooth loss. The concept of preventative dental care, cleaning teeth to prevent problems rather than addressing pain after it starts, would represent a fundamental shift in thinking about health. Our expectation of keeping most or all of our teeth throughout our lives would seem like an unrealistic luxury to people who consider tooth loss an inevitable part of aging. The simple mint-flavored toothpaste that we take for granted would blow their minds compared to their abrasive tooth powders made from crushed bones and ashes. The volume of water we use for hygiene would astound someone from a water-scarce Mediterranean environment. The average modern shower uses more clean water than an entire ancient Greek family might access in a day. Our casual approach to this precious resource, letting taps run while brushing teeth, flushing toilets containing only liquid waste, taking lengthy showers, would seem wastefully extravagant. Without aqueducts, indoor plumbing, or water treatment facilities, every drop of water used for ancient hygiene required physical labor to transport from source to use point. Our effortless access to unlimited clean water represents perhaps the single greatest hygiene advancement since ancient times, yet we barely notice this miracle that ancient Greeks would have considered divine intervention. Food hygiene would represent another realm of astonishing advancement. Refrigeration alone would seem magical. The ability to preserve perishable foods for days or weeks without salting, smoking, or pickling them. Our understanding of bacteria and food safety, while common knowledge today, represents thousands of years of scientific advancement since ancient Greece. The concept of expiration dates, food safety regulations, and standardized sanitation practices in food preparation would transform the ancient Greek relationship with foodborne illness from inevitable occasional suffering to preventable and rare. The simple act of washing produce with clean, safe tap water represents a luxury beyond anything possible in the ancient world, where water used for cleaning food might itself be contaminated. Modern fabric care would similarly impress our ancient visitor. Washing machines and dryers accomplish in hours what would have required a full day of physical labor at the river. Our detergents remove stains that would have been permanent in ancient textiles. The concept of dry cleaning for delicate fabrics would seem particularly sophisticated compared to the limited cleaning options for ancient woolens. Even our basic understanding of different fabric care requirements, separating colors, using appropriate water temperatures, selecting specific cleaning agents for different materials, represents a level of specialization that would seem unnecessarily complex to someone used to basic washing techniques for a limited range of natural fibers. The simple fact that the average modern person owns more clothes than an ancient Greek might see in a lifetime would itself be shocking. Modern medicine's relationship with hygiene would perhaps be the most impressive advancement to our ancient visitor. The germ theory of disease, antiseptic surgical techniques, antibiotics, and vaccines have transformed threats that regularly killed ancient Greeks into easily preventable or treatable conditions. The simple practice of medical professionals thoroughly washing hands between patients, something not even considered in ancient healing, has saved countless lives. A modern hospital sanitation protocols would seem almost religiously obsessive to someone from a pre-germ theory world. Yet these practices have dramatically reduced infection and mortality rates. The connection between microscopic organisms and disease represents a fundamental paradigm shift in human understanding that has extended countless lives. Environmental hygiene represents an area where we've both advanced and regressed compared to ancient Greece. Our waste treatment facilities process volumes that would have overwhelmed ancient systems, but our production of non-biodegradable waste creates environmental problems beyond anything the Greeks could have imagined. Ancient Greek waste was primarily organic and biodegradable. Modern waste includes plastics that will outlast our civilization. Our clean streets and sophisticated garbage collection systems would impress ancient visitors, but the massive landfills and ocean garbage patches would horrify them. The scale of our hygiene infrastructure, treatment plants, sewer systems, waste management, represents remarkable engineering achievements. Yet our environmental footprint suggests we've solved immediate hygiene problems while creating longer-term ones. So after this deep dive into ancient Greek bathroom habits, what's the takeaway? Perhaps it's that humans have always sought dignity through cleanliness, even when the methods were crude by modern standards. The Greeks understood intuitively what science would later confirm, that hygiene is fundamental to both physical health and social cohesion. They created remarkable systems with the technology available to them, from aqueducts to public baths to waste management. Their philosophical connection between physical cleanliness and moral virtue continues to influence Western thought, even as our specific practices have evolved. Would you trade your modern bathroom for a communal toilet bench and a slave with a strigil? Probably not. But would ancient Greeks be impressed by how thoroughly we've addressed the hygiene challenges that plague them? Absolutely. So the next time you complain about a public bathroom being disgusting because the soap dispenser is empty, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come from communal sponge sticks and open sewers. The simple act of turning a tap for clean water represents a luxury beyond the imagination of even the wealthiest ancient Greek. Our hygiene practices would seem magically advanced to our ancestors, yet we take them for granted daily. Perhaps the ultimate irony is that with all our technological advantages, we're still fundamentally pursuing the same goals as those ancient Greeks: dignity, health, and social acceptance through cleanliness. We just have better tools and more pleasant-smelling products for the job. And thankfully, nobody has to scrape the oil off our bodies with a curved metal tool after the gym anymore. Some aspects of historical authenticity are better left in the past.